Jamie Cowen here to talk to you today about what's all the fuss about the critical race theory. With all the uproars from the Republican Party, you would think that educators are proposing to introduce the God is dead philosophy into the public school systems. Rather, the racial protests from last year highlighted the idea that some American systems and institutions may have a racial bias. That's the gist of critical race theory. And with the American experience with slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and Jim Crow laws, why does that seem all that surprising? Following World War II, numerous church institutions began to re-examine Christian theology because it finally dawned on Christian theologians that maybe Christian theology contributed to the Holocaust. The most significant reckoning occurred during Vatican II in the 1960s, when the Catholic Church formally rejected the long popular view that the Jews killed Christ and condemned anti-Semitism outright. Since then, thousands of books and conferences have addressed the phenomenon of Christian anti-Semitism, leading to a revolutionary revised view of the Jewish people by the Christian world. I've participated in some of those conferences. I remember one in Kiev, the Ukraine in 1997, where I spoke several times to hundreds of Christian leaders and confronted them with historic Christian anti-Semitism. I even showed them that a picture of the person responsible for killing more Jews than anyone until Adolf Hitler was depicted on their $5 currency note. In other words, their history and institutions were infused with anti-Semitism. The revelations came as a shock and caused great remorse and repentance. Coincidentally, the last time I was in the Ukraine, which was in May of 2019, the Ukrainians elected a Jew to be president. The point is, how we understand ourselves, our histories, and our narratives need frequent re-examination. The Bible attests to this. Listen from Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me into the way of everlasting. What's the point of asking God to examine us if all we're going to do is defend ourselves, our perspectives, and our ways of life, especially when confronted by others concerning these things? Honestly, that's the point of critical race theory. It's asking us to examine our institutions to see if they're influenced by racial bias. And what's wrong with that? When many African American communities are plagued by crime, poor health, broken families, and poverty, are we willing to admit that maybe there's something wrong with the system? Or do we repeat what the church fathers said about the Jews, that they were a cursed race and their troubles were an example to what happens to those who reject Christ? This occurred while failing to acknowledge that the Jews' so-called troubles were caused by Christian rejectionism. I was a history major in college, and I've taught Jewish and world history in many countries. In 1995, I was approached by some Russian immigrant friends to see if our congregation would sponsor a ceremony honoring Victory Day, the day the Nazis surrendered to the Allies. That year was the 50th anniversary. I said sure, but I figured I needed to find out more about the day. I ordered several editions of a Russian magazine translated into English that highlighted this Victory Day and how it was celebrated throughout the years in Russia. I was shocked. This was the biggest annual event throughout the Soviet years from the time of World War II. Even as a history major in college, I never knew that approximately 27 million Russians died during the war, compared to 405,000 lost Americans. That by the time of D-Day, the Russian army was advancing against the Germans on all fronts, and it was only a matter of time before the Germans would be defeated. This is not to negate the tremendous sacrifice of American soldiers who fought in the war, including my father, nor the importance of the D-Day invasion. But the reality of the war's end was far more complex and comprehensive than D-Day being the pivotal event of the war. Yet that's not how I understood the war experience until I was faced with this new information. Similarly, as great as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were, the reality is they were slaveholders. When I was growing up, My idol was the New York Yankee baseball star Mickey Mantle. To my utter shock and dismay, I discovered as a young teen that he tried to pick up the friend of one of my friend's mothers after a ball game in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a great baseball player, but his personal life was another story. If we readily acknowledge that we are all sinners in need of the saving grace of God, can't we acknowledge that the institutions that we built also are in need of re-examination and repair? The Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony used the imagery espoused by Jesus the Messiah of building a city on a hill upon which the eyes of all people will look. But when we turn to Yeshua's actual address on the Sermon on the Mount, he follows the visionary statement of the city on a hill with a series of laws and standards that will help build that city. Yet if we're honest enough, we must admit that none of us ever fully meets those standards. Shouldn't we be open to the fact that sin still exists in the camp and needs addressing and rectification? That's the point of critical race theory. Not, of course, to make us right with God, but rather to address inherent inequities in the American system. Look, I now live and am a citizen of a country of miracles, that is, the nation of Israel. Unlike the United States, Israel's existence is the direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy. But does that mean its modern history and institutions fully reflect the city on a hill imagery? No way! Israel, like other nations, is a mixed bag. Its treatment of the Palestinians is deplorable, probably comparable to the South's treatment of African Americans during the Jim Crow era. As I've shared before, I've been part of reconciliation conferences between Israeli Messianic Jews and Palestinian Christians. Hearing the Palestinian stories rocked my world. I could have rejected their perspective and claimed that it was fake news, or I could listen and to begin to reevaluate my own perspective. I believe this is the Yeshua way. The book of James says we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For men's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. I'm going to be honest. I've lived a privileged life. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Both my parents were college educated. We had a stable family. I received a good education, and my father helped me get my first job. My wife and I and our daughters first lived in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and later in the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, until moving to Israel. Sure, there were challenges, but we've also lived a stable life. Many people haven't been so fortunate. Being a congregational leader for many years, I witnessed some sorrowful stories. There's no way that I could fully understand what it's like living as an African American, or poor, or uneducated, or from a broken home, or worse, having a criminal record. You see, there are different systems for people with different experiences. This is why God's greatest gift to us was sending his son Yeshua to live among us and see what it was like to live as a human in a broken world. Can't we do the same? To listen to the other's experiences and narratives and realize that our own experiences are quite limited? See, that's the gist of critical race theory. We should be listening. Thank you, and see you next time.